Last week was the first week that we recorded this, and I actually learned some things last week. First of all, so I went back and listened to it because I thought I might have said something that I didn't intend to say, right? So I went back and listened. But as I was listening, I realized, wow, there's a big chunk of silence. You remember when I went and wrote on the board?
Yeah.
So then I didn't say anything, and I thought, that's not going to be very good for somebody at home listening to the tape. So we'll try to not have too many big empty spaces today. So the other thing I discovered as I listened to it was that the people listening to it at home won't have the advantage of the PowerPoint. And so when you see a slide that has a bunch of blanks to fill in and they're filled in, that's okay. But for somebody listening at home, that's not going to work for them. So I have to kind of work out that kink. The other thing, so the thing that I was thought I was confused about, I did make mention last Sunday, the Septuagint. And I thought, did I say Greek or did I say Latin? I said Latin, yeah. So, yeah. Did you notice that at the time? Yeah. Okay. So the Septuagint. This is kind of important in the sense that when we started translating from Hebrew and Greek, we tried to use the best available manuscripts, and so for a long time, this Septuagint version, which was the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, and many translations really relied heavily on the Septuagint when they were translating from the Hebrew Old Testament into some other language. And so that the Vulgate, which was a Latin version, but it was much later, and eventually became the translation that the Catholic Church adopted and said, this is what we're going to use as our official translation. So I just wanted to clarify that. Have some questions. Some too raised some good questions last week, and so I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about these. I'll try not to spend a ton of time because we got lots we need to do. I feel like we're going slower than I planned to go, but at the same time I want to make sure that we all stay together, and I also want to make sure that we actually get a lot of stuff that will be helpful to us down the road. So it might take a little longer. Anyway, so Sumtu's first question was, last week you had shown us in one of your slides pictures of the Old and New Testament books of the Bible on the shelves, but I counted 13 books that were categorized under Pauline books, whereas you wrote that there were 12 in your handout on page 2, so which is right? 13 is correct, thank you for... But actually the picture was just a graphic and wasn't intended to be... it doesn't even show Pauline epistles on it. It just says letters. But I noticed when I went back and looked at it, if you add up the first 2 shelves, they're 13. That must be what you did when you saw the bookshelf. So typically the New Testament letters we would divide up into Pauline epistles and general epistles. We talked about that last week. There is some discrepancy because some people would say that Paul wrote 14 books. And that's because we're not sure who wrote the book of Hebrews. And so the book of Hebrews, a lot of people feel like it was written by Paul, but he doesn't actually say that. The book of Hebrews doesn't say who wrote it. So some people say, well, it's Paul's style and etc. So anyway, typically we say there are 13. So you want to change that on your sheet. If you brought your sheet with you on page 2, under the section that says New Testament, it says there are 12 books that we refer to as Pauline epistles. That should be 13. And thank you, Somtu, for being alert and making sure that we got this right. Okay, so the second question was, when the woman at the well that you had mentioned last week said to Jesus, our father Jacob, dug this well and drank from it, etc., did she mean to infer that Jacob was only the father of the Samaritans? This is actually a 3-part question. Okay? Did she mean that Jacob was only the father of the Samaritans? And also, why was there such a great divide between the Jews and the Samaritans? And part 3, and does that divide still exist today? So my first question is, why did I mention this the first week? This is.
From Shechem, how important Shechem was.
Okay. Because when Abraham is called in Genesis 12, and he makes that journey to the land of Canaan, he settles at a place called Shechem. Okay. Shechem, do you remember that? We talked about that. We even I showed you an archaeological dig of the city of Shechem. Okay. And that figured throughout, important city throughout Old Testament history. And when we get to the New Testament, and Jesus is going through Samaria, he stops at a village, the village of Sychar, which is the same village as was called Shechem in the Old Testament. So that's why I mentioned that. So his question is, number 1, did she mean that Jacob was only the father of the Samaritans? I would say no. She knew better than that. Jacob was the father of both the Jews and the Samaritans, and she would have known that very well. And in fact, she said, so we say the proper place to worship is on the mountain, Mount Gerizim, but you say it's in Jerusalem. So what's right? And remember, Jesus' answer was, the day's coming when it won't be in Jerusalem or up on the mountain, but God desires people who will worship Him in spirit and in truth, in Africa and China and Canada and wherever, right? So I'm quite sure that she wasn't thinking that Jacob is the father of only the Samaritans. So the second part of the question was, and why was there such a great divide between the Jews and the Samaritans? So we will cover this probably in a couple of weeks, but I will give you the short answer to the question, is that eventually this group of people, these descendants of Abraham, become a nation after they go to Egypt and they get the law and they land and they end up in the land of Canaan. And there's a couple of pieces to that are really important. But first of all, they had this nation of Israel was together in one kingdom, and we call it the United Kingdom. But after the death of Solomon, so there was Saul, David, and Solomon. After the death of Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam became king, and he decided he was going to really tax the people to pay for a lot of stuff. So Jacob had this same Jacob that she's talking about. Jacob had 12 sons that eventually became the leaders of 12 tribes in Israel. So when they settled in the land, they divided it up among 12 tribes. They were all together during the United Kingdom, but when Solomon's son said, we're going to change some things, 10 of the tribes revolted and separated and became what we call the northern kingdom of Israel. That's where this started. Because the two tribes that stayed, so during all this period of the United Kingdom, they had worshipped in Jerusalem. But when you have a split, so like even in churches, so church has a split, and some people go off and start something new, they're probably going to find a new place to worship, and whether it's on the hill or whatever. And so the 10 tribes who separated said, well, we have to have a place to worship, so they set Mount Gerizim as a place to worship. Their capital city became Samaria. So you got these two kingdoms, and the Jewish people in the southern kingdom of the other two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they felt that the Samaritans, well, first of all, they had, part of that transition was they began to worship idols. And in fact, there's several references in Scripture that will talk about Jeroboam, who was the leader of that coup, or whatever you call it, as the one who caused Israel to sin. And by that it means that he led Israel into idolatry, because the people who had lived in the land were idol worshippers before they came. And so it says Jeroboam is the one who caused Israel to sin and go back to worshiping idols. So that was one of the issues. The other issue was that the Jews felt that the Samaritans had intermarried with the people of the land and were no longer pure Jews. And so that's like 1,000 years before Jesus and the woman at the well. Okay? 1,000 years earlier, and they're still 1,000 years later, there's still this, and the last part of his question was, and does this divide still exist today? And I would say absolutely yes. So if you're familiar with modern history in Israel, there's a piece of, actually two pieces of, in this land of what used to be the land of Palestine. One is called the West Bank, and one's called the Gaza Strip. And so if you see lots in the news, there'll be conflicts between Israel and the West Bank, because Israel actually controls this land, although the green part, as you can see, is governed under a Palestinian authority. So the Samaritans today would mostly be Palestinians, okay? And just a little bit of reading I did, there's like, in the West Bank, there are like 3 million Palestinians, 300,000 Jews. So they're actually in majority in this piece of the country, but Israel still, and you notice all those little black tents in that picture? Those are Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and that's the source of great controversy in that part of the world today, is that the Palestinians say, get those Jews out of here. This is our land. And the Jews say, no, we have a right to live here. Our ancestors have lived here, and we've built. And then part of it, you'll see also that they build walls. So they build walls to separate, and there'll be terrorist attacks and all that kind of stuff in. So the short answer to your question is, it started 1,000 years ago, and it still goes on today, and who knows when it'll end. Okay, I need to move on, or we won't have any time left. But his next question was, did the 400 years of the Israelites' captivity in Egypt include the time of Joseph, or did it begin after his death? I think it probably began after his death, because we don't read about it until we get to Exodus. But here's some scriptures you might, I was just going to show you another picture. So here's some scriptures you might want to write down. The interesting thing is that there are two different numbers given for the period of captivity. One is 400 years and one is 430 years. And so you might want to mull that over in your mind a little bit. My answer to that is a couple of things. One is that it depends on when you start counting as to how many years it was total. And the other is that sometimes I don't think the Bible was necessarily trying to give specific numbers. So my example is that next year, it will be 50 years since Sharon and I went to India as missionaries. Hard to believe. How could that possibly happen? Our first son was born in India. But anyway, so 50 years ago. So sometimes people will talk to us, oh, you went to India. So how long were you in India? My answer is 4 years. Sharon's answer, 3.5. Because she wants to be precise. Actually, I think if you wanted to be really precise, it was 3 years and 7 months. So when I think, 50 years later, it doesn't matter. Like, it was about 4 years. But she always wants to say 3.5 years and make it exactly right. So I think that's sometimes what we do, is we kind of just say, it's 4 years. And 50 years later, nobody cares how many months it was, right? So anyway, so you can look at those scriptures. So God's promise to Abraham was really that they would go down to Egypt and they would be slaves. And then there's several references after that, including in the New Testament. Okay, next question. Did the Lord actually... I'm going to back up here for a second. Did the Lord God actually curse the woman and the man? Some argue that he did not really curse the man. I don't think that's right. Paul is very logical. First of all, God says to the serpent, because you sinned, this is your punishment. Then he says to the woman, because you sinned, this is your punishment. And then he says to the man, because you sinned, this is your punishment. So I think it would be hard to argue that there's a separation. That's my opinion. Okay?
Sorry, like punishment will be different from the cause. Like,
Different than the cause?
yeah. Like
Okay.
if your cause is,
Pardon?
Punishment versus curse.
Okay.
yeah, I think there's difference, right?
Oh yeah, there's yeah,
So like man wasn't actually caused but punished. But the serpent was.
Yeah, is there a difference between the punishment and the curse?
between the serpent and
Between punishment
oh,
and curse.
and the curse. Oh, okay, okay.
Is it the same thing? Can you say punished?
Yeah. You know, I don't know. I mean, in reality, because they ate the fruit, there were consequences that last forever. So can you say that's a curse? Well, in some ways it's a curse because you're stuck with it and you can't do anything about it, right? But it's also a punishment because of your behavior. So I think that would be hard to argue, but that's my opinion. Okay. Okay. The last question was, so was the location of Egypt in the Bible the same as its location today? And I would say, you know, maybe not exactly because boundaries change a little bit, but I don't think Egypt has changed very much, right? It's, I would say, fairly close to where it was then is fairly close to where it is today. Good question, Psalm 2, and thank you so much for. And if you have questions, for me the best way to deal with that, write it out, give it to me, and then the next week I'll try to spend a few minutes. And I'll try to not spend too many minutes because... Yeah. Okay. So I want to go back to this map here. Why is my thing not moving? Because this is so foundational to. It might be in your sheet. I don't know if it is, but it probably is. Yeah. Yeah. So, but this is so foundational. I'm just going to step over here for a second so I can use my pointer. So most all of the Old Testament history happens in this area right here, all the way from down here, around here, and down into Egypt here. So almost all of Old Testament history happens there, which is really, I think significant. So as we said earlier, anthropologists think that civilization started in the Mesopotamian Valley. Certainly the biblical record would suggest that. So the Garden of Eden was somewhere between these two rivers. We don't know exactly where it was, but it was somewhere between those. There's two other rivers that are given that we're not sure where they are, but it was somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Most people think it was down here somewhere. And then the next event that happens in Genesis is the flood, right? And so Noah builds the boat, and he saves his family and the animals. And when the flood waters start to recede, where does he end up? You remember that? Okay, so there was a range of mountains up here that was called the Ararat Range of Mountains. And his boat comes to rest somewhere there. Some people think they've found it, and some people say they haven't, and they've even made movies about it. But anyway, it's really not very far from where all of this started. Then the next thing that happens in Genesis, and this is all in the first 11 chapters, okay? Next thing that happens is... Okay, the Tower of Babel. So that happens on the plains of Shinar, which is right here around Babylon somewhere. And they build this tower that they think they're going to get to where God is and maybe become smart like God again, whatever, like the garden. And so God confuses their languages, and they spread out all over the country. So then there's this big divide between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12, because in the first 11 chapters there's sort of this general picture of God's relationship with human beings. But in chapter 12, God calls Abraham, and that is the story throughout the rest of the Old Testament and into the New Testament. God says, I am going to make a covenant with a group of people who will be an example to all of the rest of the people on earth. Now, it didn't always go well because they didn't keep their part of the covenant very well. But anyway, so anyway, you have this story of Abraham, and he goes down, and he settles in Shechem, and he's there, and then there's Abraham, and has a son Isaac, and Jacob has 12 sons, and then one of those sons is sold as a slave into Egypt. That's Joseph. And then because there's famine in the land, they all have to go to Egypt and live in Egypt to survive the famine. And then there's a new king in Egypt who doesn't remember Joseph, and he turns them all into slaves. And so they live in slavery. Then they cross the Red Sea, and they come out here somewhere to Mount Sinai, where now God says, I'm going to renew my covenant that I made with Abraham, but now for the first time you will have a written law. Okay. Remember what we called that first part? We called it the patriarchal age, where God spoke to the fathers of the families. But now they're going to have this written law that they'll be able to know more of what God expects of their lives. So that happens down here in Mount Sinai somewhere. And then God's promise to Abraham was that he said, you follow me, and I'm going to give you this land. He didn't tell him where it was. He just said, I'm going to give you and your descendants this land. So God never forgot that promise. But when they're down here at Sinai, they are unfaithful to God in many ways. And Moses sends people to check out this land. He sends one from each of the 12 tribes, sends 12 people, check out the land, and they come back, and 10 of them said, we couldn't possibly take this land because people live in fortified cities, and there's giants living there, and there's no way that we could possibly take this land. 2 of them come back and say, yeah, but by the power of God, anything is possible. They didn't listen to the 2, they listened to the 10. And so Moses sent these people in to check out the land for 40 days. So God said, okay, because you are faithless, you will spend a year in the wilderness for every day that you spent checking out the land. So for the next 40 years, they actually wandered around here in the desert, almost in a circle, right? And really, essentially what happened is a lot of the people who... Now, you'd think that when, after 400 years of slavery, and God delivers you, that you'd be ready to go anywhere. But that's not what happened. Okay? And so a lot of the people who doubted that God could fulfill His promise, a lot of those people died in the wilderness. Okay? And so it was kind of the new generation who had a more confidence that God could accomplish His promise.
The 2 tribes that had faith in God, what happened to them? Why were they punished too?
Yes.
Even though they believed?
Yeah. So the two people who came back, Joshua and Caleb, said, "We can do this. We can, with God's power, we can take the land." But 10 of them said no, and they convinced the people they couldn't do it, and they all ended up wandering. That's not fair. No, those 2 didn't die. And actually, when they enter the promised land, Joshua is the leader. He's the next leader after Moses. Yeah. No. So, okay, good question. So then they finally they go back, and so actually they go back and they cross the Jordan River here after the 40 years, just north of the Dead Sea, and Moses has now died, and Joshua takes over the leadership, and really when they land up right here, ready to go in, that's the end of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, we're done. And now we start the books of history. And so I want to encourage you today. I asked you to learn the first 5 books, right? That's easy. Okay. The next 12 books will be a little more difficult. But you should start learning them now because we're going to get into that history real soon. Okay. So they go into the promised land, they conquer it, they divide it up among the 12 tribes, and then they complain to God because all of the other nations have a king and they don't have a king, and God says, well, I'm your king, you don't need a king. But this is one of those occasions where God said, okay, if you have to have one, then let me help you pick one. Okay? And so they had 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, and really Israel. So this, I guess this is an important thing, and I don't want to go on too long here, but you have to understand that at this time in history, every nation is vying for power, right? Whoever's got the biggest army takes over more territory, right? And they keep adding territory. And we'll see this all the way through the Old Testament story. So what is happening historically is not separate from what is happening to the people of God. Okay? So those two are running together and are sometimes overlapping with each other. So when they get to the Promised Land during the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon, they become a very powerful nation. Okay? And they take over lots of this territory here because they have become a very powerful nation. But then we talked about earlier, there's this division in the kingdom, and 10 tribes go to the north, 2 tribes stay in the south. By the way, do you know which of those 2 kingdoms Jesus came from? The south. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were the tribes that stayed in the south and became part of the southern kingdom of Judah. And it was through that lineage that Jesus would eventually be born, which factors into the question of the Samaritans, right? So anyway, so the kingdom is divided, and then after the division of the kingdom, eventually, because people rebelled and didn't obey God, God said, I'm going to punish you. Most of the time, God punished His people by allowing them to be conquered by another nation. Okay? So, the northern kingdom of Israel was eventually conquered by the Assyrians with their capital at Nineveh. They came in and took over the country in 721. We'll get to those dates, 721 BC. The southern kingdom lasted a little longer than that, and they were eventually... So what happened then, between the time that the northern kingdom was conquered and by Assyria, the new world power is Babylon. And they conquer Assyria. Okay? And they also conquer the southern kingdom of Judah, and they carry the people off as slaves to Babylon. So when you get to books like Daniel, Daniel is actually a slave living in Babylon under the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? And so that would be some of the prophetic books of the Old Testament. So then the next world power is a joint kingdom called the Medo-Persian Empire. And they conquer the Babylonians. And then you have a guy living down here in Susa whose name is Nehemiah. He was one of the slaves. And he is a cupbearer to the king. You know what a cupbearer does? He tastes the wine before the king drinks it, because if it's poisoned, he dies instead of the king, right? So that was the role of a cupbearer, right? So he has to. So he's a slave living in what has now become the world power, the new world power, the Medo-Persian Empire. But the good news is, and in fact, the prophets had said that this captivity in Babylon would last for 70 years. And it lasted for 70 years. And 70 years later, there's a new world power, and there's a guy named Cyrus, the king of Medo-Persia, and he allows the Jews to go back to the land of Palestine. And, pardon? Persia is, well, where Iran would be now. But, so, yeah. 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 So this would be, most of this territory right now is Iraq, and most of this territory is Iran. So he allows them to go back, and he governs this whole country, even down into Egypt. We'll see a map later that shows you how much territory he had. But so he actually gives them letters that allow them to go back safely. And when they get to the land of Palestine, which was occupied by the Babylonians, now it's occupied by the Medo-Persians, and he sends letters that they can have free, safe passage and even be given some of the material that they need to rebuild the city and the temple. And so that all happens, and they come back here, and then pretty much the Old Testament ends. Okay? And there's actually a period of about 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And there's some books in there that Catholics have in their Bible that we don't have in our Bible. I think we talked about that in our first session. So, and they describe that period of 400 years. Okay, so I want to keep going back to that map because it's really... It's really foundational to get in your head the whole story. Okay, this is where we ended up last week. Okay, and the people who are listening to this on the tape will not see this slide. So I'll have to help them with that. So we just tried to hit the highlights of each of the books, and we want to try and finish that today, and I have to look at my clock and see how much time we have to do that. Okay, so Genesis, highlights of Genesis are creation, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel. That's the first 11 chapters. Then we get into chapter 12, the call of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and I had Egypt good and Egypt bad just because Egypt bad is not really in Genesis, but it ends, that's where the story ends, and the next thing we read, they're slaves in Egypt. So Egypt good would be where Joseph rises to power in Egypt. Remember he interpreted the dream about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows, and said there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so the Pharaoh puts him in charge of the program, and they prepare. And then the rest of his family have to come to Egypt to buy food because there's no food in Canaan. And but eventually, a new Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph, and he turns them all into slaves. Then we get to Exodus and Moses and the 10 plagues. I think we talked about this last time. And I said there's a couple of questions in the Bible that are really neat questions. And one of the great questions of the Old Testament is when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and say, God wants you to let his people go into the wilderness. And Pharaoh's question is, who is God? Who's God? I have to listen to him, right? Eventually he figures out who God is, but it will take 10 different plagues before he gets to that place that he knows who God is. The question in the New Testament, I think, that is so profound is when Jesus is on trial and they take him to Pilate, and Pilate's question is, what is truth? That's Pilate's question to Jesus, because the Jews are saying crucify him, and Pilate said, I don't see anything worthy of death. But in that discussion with Jesus, he says, what is truth? And that's such a great question, I think. Anyway, 10 plagues, and then we have the Passover. We talked about the Passover, which is still celebrated by Jewish people today, very significant in their history, because what was the 10th plague? Okay, the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And so Moses said, before that happens, you're supposed to kill a lamb and sprinkle the blood over the door. And then when the death angel comes, he will pass over your house, and the people in your house won't die. That's exactly what happened. And so all in Egypt, the firstborn of all the people, even the animals, the firstborn died. But the firstborn of the Israelites didn't die. And so finally Pharaoh said, get out of my country. Right? Leave, please go. And the people of Egypt said, yeah, get out quickly. And they gave them gold and silver and food and cattle and animals and all kinds of stuff. Said, please get out of our country. If you don't get out of here, we're all going to die. Right? And so they left. And of course, the story when they got to the Red Sea, Pharaoh changed his mind, gathered his army, chased after them, and God delivered them through the Red Sea. So they got freedom on the other side, but we talked about a few minutes ago that they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years because they were faithless. But they come to Mount Sinai, and this is where God gives them the 10 Commandments, okay? All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. I don't know why I can't make... Whoa! No, I am going to make it work. Okay, 10 Commandments. Okay, I wanted to read this verse, kind of middle of Exodus. Then Moses went up to God, this is on Mount Sinai, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all of the nations of the earth, out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and of holy nations. These are the words you speak to the people of Israel. So God is just saying, kind of renewing what he said to Abraham. You leave your home and your family and you go to where I will show you, and I will make a covenant relationship with you. And now that's sort of being renewed with this group of people that is being formed into a nation, the nation of Israel, descendants of Jacob. And God said, out of all of the peoples of the earth, I picked you to be in a covenant relationship with me so that you could be a holy nation and that you could be an example to the nations around you of how you should live in relationship to God and live in relationship to other people. Okay, so I think that's just an important verse. Okay, so then we get to the rest of Exodus and lots of other laws in the book. And part of that is the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was a portable church building. Okay, they called it the tent of meeting. It was a portable tent that they set, so they carried it with them, and whenever they stopped, these 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness, whenever they stopped, they set up this tent of meeting, and God said, that's where I will meet with you. I will meet with you in the tabernacle. Okay? And so it had to be a big job, but they carried it with them wherever they went, and they set it up, and God said, I'll meet with you there. So then inside, the other thing that they had was what they called the Ark of the Covenant, which was like a box with poles. And inside the Ark of Covenant, and they would always put that in the tabernacle when they got the tabernacle set up, but inside of this ark were the 2 tables of stone that Moses got the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Also in the ark was Aaron's rod. Remember when they did the 10 plagues in Egypt? He would take his rod and touch the river and it turned to blood. And, so Aaron's rod was in there. And there was also in there a pot of manna. So in the wilderness, they're living in the desert. There's no food. So God said, don't worry about that. I will give you food. And he gave them food every day in the form of, which was kind of like a flat bread, as I understand it. And he said, and this is really interesting because God said, I will provide. I am the God who provides. So every day he gave them manna in the morning and quail in the evening, which was a bird. The birds flew in, they slaughtered them and ate them. But some people thought, what if there's not enough for tomorrow? And God said, just take what you need for today. And some people said, well, what if none comes tomorrow? What are we going to do then? And God said, I am the God who provides. So some people went out and gathered more and brought it into their tent. They were living in tents. And by morning it was filled with maggots. And God said, I told you, you don't need to take extra. It's such a great lesson for us, though, isn't it? Just to learn to live a day at a time, deal with what we need to. God will provide. God will look after it. And just do what we... And not have this mentality of getting and hoarding and keeping and having, right? That's our challenge. Anyway, so Moses is up on the mountain, and while he's gone, the people think, what happened to this guy? He's been gone a long time. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he died up on the mountain. We better get a new leader, right? And some of them even wanted to go back to Egypt because life is not very good in the desert. And maybe we should go back to Egypt. So while he's up on the mountain, they gather all of the gold and the silver they have, and they form it into a calf. What do you call it? Yeah, it's a calf, but they melted it down and fashioned it into the shape of a calf, and then started worshiping it, right? Okay. Moses comes down from the mountain, and he goes ballistic, right? And he takes the tablets of stone, smashes them on the ground, and said, "What a crazy people you are! I'm getting this message from God, and while I'm gone, here's what you're doing, right?" And so, and actually, God is about ready to wipe them out. And Moses said, well, just a minute. And this is an interesting story because Moses says, well, just a minute, because what are the nations going to think if you kill all your people right now? Right? What are the nations going to think? I mean, you brought them out of Egypt, you saved them, you brought them out here to the desert, now you kill them all. So what kind of a God does that? So anyway, Moses goes back up the mountain, and God gives him the 10 Commandments again, okay? And so my last thing on there was reboot. That's not actually what the Bible calls it, but it's starting over again, right? He goes back up the mountain, do the 10, come down, and let's go again. Okay. All right, so here's another really, I think, interesting verse toward the end of the book. Moses said to the Lord, you have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and I know you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. So that's Mount Sinai. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? I think it's a powerful passage. Moses said, the only way that we are any different than anybody else on the face of the earth is if you are with us. Otherwise, we're just stupid people, right? But the only way anybody is going to know that we're your people is if your presence goes with us. And what a great admonition for us, even in our time. The only difference, we're weak, we're fickle, we sin, we do stupid things. We're not always as faithful as we should be. The only thing that separates us is that we believe God is with us, and we're trying to be what God wants. Okay, we're going to do this real quick. How much time have I got? 8 minutes. Okay, we're going to do this quick. You can write down these two scriptures. There. You can write them down on your sheet and look them up afterwards. So, book of Leviticus, this is really the beginning of the shaping of a nation. And so as you go through the book, it's pretty hard to read, right? There's a lot of stuff that doesn't make any sense to us. But lots of details about offerings that they're supposed to make to God. Lots of details about the priesthood. So out of those 12 tribes, God picked one tribe that would be the priests, and that was the tribe of Levi. When we get to the dividing up of the land, you'll see they didn't get an inheritance in the land because they're supposed to be the priests, right? Okay, there's a lot of rules and regulations about health and hygiene, which I think was important for them at that time. A lot of rules and regulations about feasts. And Jubilee, I just want to take a minute on that. In our first session, when we were talking about manuscripts and scrolls, you remember that? And I read from Luke chapter 4, where Jesus went into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up to read, and they gave him the scroll of Isaiah, and he read from the scroll of Isaiah and said, basically, I am the fulfillment of what was written in Isaiah. And he talks about, releasing the captives and all that kind of stuff. And he talks about the year of the Lord's favor. I think that goes all the way back to Leviticus 25. So here's a really interesting thing. It would be nice to live this way in some ways. But God said to His people, first of all, I own everything. You don't know anything. You are just tenants in the land. I own it all. So, every 50 years will be the year of Jubilee. And that means that you won't work, you won't plant grain, you won't harvest grain. It's a sacred year to God. And in that year, a lot of amazing things are going to happen. Because the land that was owned by the people would always be theirs. So, if during that 50 years I run onto hard times and I need money, I can sell some of my land to Kristen for a price, but on the year of Jubilee, she has to give it back. Now, that's an interesting concept, right? And God said, because I own it all. You are just tenants, okay? So, if people had to hire themselves out as slaves because they got into financial difficulty, on the year of Jubilee, they're set free. And so what they would do then is if I need money, I can sell some of my land to Kristen, but the price that she's going to pay me is calculated on the basis of how many crops she can harvest from the land before Jubilee. Because in Jubilee, she's got to give back again, right? Okay. So Jubilee was an amazing thing for this wandering group of Hebrew people. But Jesus puts another twist on it in Luke chapter 4. And Jesus said, I'm the fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah, and I have come to set people free. And for this to be a year, this to be a celebration of joy and freedom and salvation and all those kinds of things. Wish I had more time to talk about that. Okay, numbers. Numbers is numbers, okay? That's what it means, it's numbers. And when you start reading it, it's just a whole bunch of numbers, right? And I've put two things. So you might ask the question, how come the Pharaoh of Egypt got so worried about the Hebrew people? Well, it's because when they went down to Egypt, there were only 70 people. Not counting the women, okay? Not counting the wives of Jacob's sons. 70 people went down to Egypt. When they were delivered from Egypt and went into the wilderness, there were 600,000 people. So if you have them living in your country, you're going to be a little bit concerned about them, right? 600,000 people now living in Egypt. And what happens if they revolt? What happens if they start a coup in my country? I better make them slaves, okay? So a lot of that is about that. All of the numbering of the tribes, more laws, leaving Sinai. As we talked about earlier, they sent these 12 people to explore the land of Canaan. But they come back and 10 of them say we can't do it, and so God says, okay, then you have to be punished. One other thing in the book of Numbers is what they did was they established, when they got into the land, they established cities of refuge. Okay, another great concept. So God said if I accidentally kill somebody, so my neighbor is at my house and my ox falls over on him and kills him, my neighbor will want to take vengeance against me because he died. But I could flee to one of the cities of refuge and I would be safe there. Now, I don't have freedom to go all over the country, but I didn't do it intentionally. It was an accident. But my neighbor wants to take revenge. I can run to a city of refuge and live there the rest of my life. And the family of the person who died cannot take vengeance upon me. If I leave the city, then I'm fair game, right? But as long as I remain in the city of refuge, I am. Now, that didn't happen if I killed him intentionally, but if it was an accident, I can run to the city of refuge. Anyway, lots of really good things about that. Deuteronomy, this is our last book. A lot of overlap in the book of Deuteronomy from the previous books. The Ten Commandments are repeated. There's lots more laws. I need a Bible so I can read this verse. Deuteronomy 24 and 19. Again, I'm throwing in a few of these verses because I want us to try and understand who God is and what God is like, because that's such a big part of the story. So in Deuteronomy 24, verses 19 to 22, so God is basically speaking. He's saying, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf. Now, how many of you know what a sheaf is? Okay? Some of us are farmers, right? We came from the farm, right? So I remember stooking sheaves when I was... So it's a bundle of grain. Okay. All right. So you guys know. Okay. So when you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. And when you beat the olives from the trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again, but leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. This is why I command you to do this. Doesn't that tell you something about God? I find that very touching, because even in this very primitive time, God has a heart for people. And so the alien, these weren't even Jewish people. These were people who had just kind of come and joined them for whatever reason. Some of them may even have been slaves. And yet God just says, don't be selfish. Think about other people. So when you harvest, you leave a little bit, right? And these other people are going to come along afterwards. And they're going to be able to pick up the stuff that you left, and they'll have something to live on. And I think that's just such a powerful picture of who God is. Okay, blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy. God says if you do what's right, then this is going to happen to you. If you do what's wrong, this is what happened to you. And then finally, the book of Deuteronomy closes with the death of Moses, who actually didn't get to go into the promised land. Right? Led the people all the way through that journey. We got to the edge, but he didn't actually go into the promised land. Okay, so this is my last slide. The most tedious part has been done. That should be an encouragement to us that, yeah, hallelujah, is that we got the most difficult. And really the thing is, when people start reading the Bible, this is where they start reading, and they might get through Genesis, maybe a little of Exodus, and then, oh my goodness, what kind of stuff is this, right? In Leviticus, yeah. Oh my goodness, all the laws and rules and regulations and most of them don't make sense. And so anyway, this is the most tedious part, but it's a valuable part of their journey and their history. And so here's what I want to suggest that you do is for next week, we're going to start in the books of history next week. And so you need to learn, now you've already learned the books of the law. Now you need to learn the books of the history, because eventually you're going to know all 66 books of the Bible and be able to say them without looking in the index, okay? So start learning the books of history, but it's actually not as hard as you might think it is. So here's how I would do it. If you don't know what they are, here's how I would do it. There are 3 sets of 3, okay? And just remember, there's 3 sets of 3, and you can keep track of that. So you've got Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Okay, and that's a specific period of their history. Okay, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And then you got Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Now there's 1st and 2nd, but you can easily remember that. So you just have to remember there's Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Okay, there's Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Then there's Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, which is really the bulk of that united kingdom and divided kingdom. Most of it happens in those books. And then you've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther is the third set of 3. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and that would be after the captivity, in captivity, and after captivity, coming back to the land again. Okay, so really Joshua, Judges, and Ruth is before the United Kingdom. Then you've got those 6 books of 1st and 2nd, 1st and 2nd, 1st and 2nd, which is the bulk of United Kingdom and Divided Kingdom and off to captivity. And then you've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which is the other part of that story. So 3 sets of 3, and you can remember the 12 books of history in the Old Testament. So, and it is 9:31. So, hallelujah. Yes. Thank you for coming. We will try to move a little bit quicker, but we're getting into some really interesting stuff as we get into the books of history. Very fascinating stories, and helps us to piece it all together. And so many things that we could talk about. So I'll just end with this, but we didn't have time to do it when we went through. So Moses goes up to the mountain to meet God and get the 10 Commandments and everything. And when he comes back down, the people find that they can't look at him. You remember why that was? His face was radiant. His face was radiant. And they were afraid to look at him. He had been with God, and it's kind of like the glory of God and being in God's presence. It kind of rubbed off on Moses a little bit. And so then after a while it would fade away. So what he would do is he would put a veil over his face. And he would lift the veil when he went up to meet with God, and then when he came back down, put the veil over his face so that people wouldn't be afraid. It's a great story, but it doesn't end there. Because when you get to the New Testament, and you get to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and Paul talks about Moses, and he says sometimes the Jewish people, when they read the Scripture, the veil is still over their face because they can't see Jesus in their Scriptures. And so, but Paul says, but in Jesus, the veil is removed, and we can see clearly God's plan for mankind right from the beginning to the end. And then a beautiful verse, he says, and we all with unveiled faces behold the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another. It's such a beautiful thing when you see the history and you see that being told again in a different way that gives us great understanding. So anyway, thank you for coming. I will end. Yeah, and have a muffin if you didn't have one.
Ruth and Esther, the ladies' name.
Yes.
Did they actually write their books?
No. I don't think they wrote their stories of them. Yeah, I don't think they wrote them. No. Okay.
Ladies didn't write the Bible.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, if you look in in Matthew chapter 1, I think it's Matthew 1, where they're giving the genealogy of Jesus. There are a whole bunch of women in that story that shouldn't be there. Because you've got Rahab, who was a prostitute in Jericho. She becomes an ancestor of Jesus. You've got Ruth, who was a foreigner from outside of Israel. She figures in. So it's just an interesting thing that even though God chose this group to be His in covenant relationship and try to be an example to others, He still wasn't exclusive. And He brought other people into the story. Esther, yeah. Just amazing.
If we got questions, can we just email you?
Sure you can. And if I get too many questions, I'll do some, but I won't do them all because we need to get through the material.
I know. You don't have to say it in class. You can just email me.
Okay. Okay, sure.
My main question right now is, why isn't that 400 years in the Bible?
Why isn't it in the Bible? That's a good question. Yeah. I don't know.
Oh, well, you don't even know the answer.
No.
Okay.
Actually, I said that in the first class, is that there's some questions I don't have an answer for. And that'd be one of them, yeah.
The Reformation guys from your first class said they sat down and decided what went in the Bible and what didn't.
Yeah.
Okay, but a person can find out that 400
Yeah, there's
through historical
yeah.
Catholic?
Yeah, the Catholic Bible and that's the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, they include the Bibles, but there's in that period of time, Jerusalem was taken over again by foreigners. And then there was a family who were Jewish people. They were called the Maccabees. And a guy named Judas rallied the troops, and he defeated the enemies and drove them out of Jerusalem. And they restored worship again for a period of time, until the Greeks came and the Romans came and that sort of thing. Yeah. So, but that's not biblical. So these books, I guess we talked about that maybe in our first class or second class, is the word that we use is books that are canonical. That means books that fit the measure, that measured up to the standard, were included in the Bible. Other books that people might have read and thought that they were accurate and everything, but they didn't measure up to the standard that the Christians who were doing it felt they had to measure up to be in. So that's why the Catholics have those books in their Bible. We don't have them in our Bible, because in the Protestant Reformation, people said these books don't measure up to the standard.
And where are the books of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel? Where are those books?
They're in.
When you're reading in the Bible, and say, if you want to know more about the king of Jehoram or whatever,
Yeah.
you can read it in the history books of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. Where are those books?
Well, they would be outside of the Bible. They would be records that Egypt kept or somebody kept.
Where are all these records kept?
Museum somewhere. Yeah. But actually the kings, like Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, will give you all of the kings that reigned in Israel during those times. I think there was 17 in the northern kingdom and 17 or 18 in the southern kingdom.
It's like you just read that in the Bible. So
Yes.
if you want to read more about what these kings did, you
Yeah.
find it in
Find it in the Chronicles of the Kings or something. Yeah. And those wouldn't be complete necessarily, but they would be pieces, and they would be in museums. Yeah.